Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The laughter of her friends echoed in the chilly night air as Sally hugged them one by one, feeling the warmth of their bodies against her own. Their evening had been filled with delectable food and drinks that slid down her throat like liquid gold. Her tummy was full, she was a little tipsy, and suddenly exhausted. "Are you sure you don't want us to call you a cab?" Tina asked with furrowed brows, her breath visible as she spoke from the porch. "No, I'll be fine," Sally reassured her, a confident smile plastered to her face. "It's not even 20 minutes on the subway, and they've got security walking around." In reality, Sally didn't feel as confident as she sounded, but she didn't want to trouble her friends any further, nor could she afford the expense of a cab. "All right, if you say so," Tina replied hesitantly, still not entirely convinced. "Just call me when you get home, okay? I'm staying up until I hear from you." "Will do," Sally promised, offering a final wave before turning towards the direction of the train station. The shadows cast by the towering buildings loomed over her as she navigated the maze of empty streets. Sally would never get used to the way one could find themselves in another world entirely, just a stop or two away from home. She quickened her pace as the icy wind howled through the concrete canyons, the only sound at all aside from her heels taking turns against the pavement. Rounding a corner, Sally caught sight of the familiar entrance to the subway station. Grimacing, she descended the steps into the bowels of the underground. As she reached into her bag for the train pass, she found herself talking aloud. "Just a few stops," she told herself. "I'll just wait by security until the train arrives." The flickering fluorescent lights cast distorted shadows across the platform, and as she got closer, Sally's heart sank. The security office, her only source of comfort, was empty and dark before her. Where are they? Sally wondered, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced around, anxious to appear calm and cool in case any strange eyes were following her. Yet, she saw nothing but the vacant benches and glowing ticket machines and clusters of trash and papers decorating the ground. She scanned her pass and went through the gates, which elicited a two-tone sound of acknowledgement that echoed through the empty station. As she reached the escalators, she found that they had been turned off, so she hurried down the stairs 2 at a time, reaching the empty platform in seconds and glancing around once again for any sign of the security officer. But there was no one. Nothing. Even the screens which displayed train arrival times were blank. Maybe Tina was right, Sally admitted silently, regretting her quick dismissal when her friend expressed concern. She glanced at her watch, counting the seconds as they ticked by, each one stretching on for an eternity. A sudden gust of wind swept through the station, creating a blizzard of loose debris and nearly snatching Sally's spirit from her body entirely. Then her terror gave way to relief, which in turn morphed into disappointment as she realized the arriving train was headed in the opposite direction. Sally hugged herself, trying in vain to shake off the chill that seemed to emanate from within. As she waited, her eyes darted around nervously, searching for the approaching train as the other continued on its way, with no sign of anyone in its green windows at all. She hadn't even noticed an operator in the front car. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of movement, and after allowing her eyes to focus on the faraway shadows, she spotted a figure at the other end of the platform. The dark, hulking shape swayed side to side as it moved forward slowly, and for a moment, Sally considered that the shadows themselves had come to life before her. The figure grew nearer and nearer, slowly shuffling and swaying along, and still with no discernible features. Sally's breath caught in her throat as she considered heading back upstairs for security, but she didn't want a chance missing the train. She clenched her fists tightly as beads of sweat formed on her brow. With a quick glance, she confirmed that the shadow was getting closer and closer. Then, a distant rumble tickled Sally's ears, and she eagerly looked into the tunnel at the headlights speeding toward her like a shooting star. Looking back, she saw the mysterious figure was only a few hundred feet away and was coming directly for her. "Come on, come on, come on," she said, watching the gleaming silver cars grow closer and closer. Suddenly, the dark figure was directly beside her, and she screamed, hurling herself into the nearest train car just as the doors slid open with a deafening hiss.
"You got $1?"
A raspy voice asked from behind her. Startled, Sally whirled back around to find herself face to face with a disheveled woman, buried inside of a massive, tattered coat, with its large hood pulled over her matted hair in protection.
"Sorry, dear. Didn't mean to scare you."
With shaking hands, she fumbled through her bag for a few singles. Yeah," she stammered, trying to force a polite laugh that presented more as a choking grunt. "Don't worry about it. I'm just a little jumpy, I guess."
"Thank you, dear."
The woman took Sally's offering gratefully and shared a sweet smile in return.
"You get home safe now."
With another hiss, the door between them closed, and the train jolted back into movement. Sally sighed in relief as the exterior became a blur of flickering lights and reflections and shadows, and settled into a seat nearby. Like the station, the car was empty, as were the ones in front of and behind her from what she could see. She may have been the only passenger on the entire train. Just 4 stops, she thought, counting down in her head as the train rattled along the tracks. I'll be in bed before I know it. The screech of the train pulling into the next station split the air, drowning out the rhythm of its wheels on the tracks. The doors slid open to admit a trio of young men in messy suits, their laughter and slurred speech announcing their arrival before they even staggered into view. They lurched through the doors, arms wrapped around each other for support, practically carrying the man in the middle, who could barely stand. "Look at this guy," one of them hooted, his words thick with drunken mirth. He seemed to be missing his necktie. "Can't handle his liquor." "Easy, man," said the other one doing the lifting. Though he still wore a tie, this fellow had accessorized his dress shirt with a few dark stains, and the pant of his right leg was tucked into his sock. The man in the middle sat limp as his eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, then locked onto Sally with a sudden intensity that made her blood run cold. Panic clawed at her, but she refused to let it take hold. Instead, she pulled a novel from her bag, burying her face between its pages in an effort to escape his gaze. "Don't let us bother you, miss," No Necktie said with a sheepish grin. "He's just had a bit too much." Sally tried to focus on the words in front of her, but found herself unable to make sense of the jumble of letters, her eyes scanning over the same line over and over, comprehending nothing. "Shouldn't have let him drink so much," the other muttered, shaking his head. "But I guess that's how we learn, right?" Sally risked a glance up from her book, relieved to find the man in the middle had nestled his head onto the shoulder of the man beside him. He had passed out, and though she was still thoroughly uncomfortable, Sally couldn't help but find it humorous to see a trio of grown men practically cuddling together in public. The subway train came to a stop at the next station, and the man in the stained shirt gently lifted his friend's flaccid head towards the other. "Sorry, buddy, this is me. You good to take care of him?" "Of course," No Necktie responded, grinning again with a flashing glance in Sally's direction. "See you later." As the car jolted into movement once again, the book slipped from Sally's grasp, landing on the floor directly in front of the pair. She quickly stood and plucked it up from the floor, wiping away the mysterious fuzz that now stuck to its cover. "Sorry, excuse me," she mumbled, shifting back to her spot. Though she was tempted to find another seat further away, she didn't want to draw any extra attention from the men. "You ever drink too much?" the conscious man asked Sally. She had no desire to respond, but couldn't risk escalation. "Don't underestimate the anger of a man ignored," Tina often reminded her. "No, not really," she said meekly. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm really close to finishing my book." The man's smile widened. "Come on, that ain't true. Pretty girl on the train this time of night had to be getting into some trouble." Sally held her breath, staring at the page before her as she tried to recall which stop they were at without looking up. She couldn't wait to bail for the safety of her apartment. Whatever," the man said. "He'll be just fine, just needs to sleep it off." Yeah, Sally stammered, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I get it." He paused, and she knew he was watching her as she kept her eyes on the book in front of her. Then he continued, in a lower voice. "You know, you'll never finish that book there if you don't turn the page." Sally laughed nervously. "I'm not great at multitasking," she said. The sharp cry of the train slowing into the next station interrupted them, and No Necktie gently shifted his friend's weight so that he now leaned against the wall. "Well, this is me," he said, standing and approaching the door. "Don't worry about him, miss, and get those pretty legs of yours home. Nothing good happens this time of night." As the doors slid shut behind the departing drunk, Sally found herself alone with the unconscious man, silently slumped against the window as the train continued towards its next destination, Sally's stop. Though she was glad to see the others go, she was appalled at these so-called friends for leaving the man like this. He was practically dead weight, and they abandoned him on the plastic bench like a forgotten glove. Sally wondered if she could get the operator's attention when she left the train, or if there might be security patrolling on the next platform. Suddenly, she felt responsible for this utterly creepy stranger, and imagined reading in the news the next day about a man robbed or worse after falling asleep drunk on the subway. She had almost placed her book back inside of her bag when she was hit by a sudden wave of terror. What if this man wasn't unconscious at all, and simply waited for his chance to follow her off the train? She didn't want to indicate that she was preparing to leave, and quickly considered ways she could shake him off if he followed, whether he was stumbling drunk or stone-cold sober. But her apartment was only 2 blocks from the station, and there was little she could do besides bursting into a sprint if the man indeed began to stalk her. At long last, the train began its gentle arc around the curve nearing the platform, and Sally planned to erupt from her seat and through the doors at the last possible second. The train seemed to be taking the curve quite swiftly, but she didn't mind. Anything to get home sooner. With the turn complete, the subway pulled into the station and came to an extremely sudden stop. Then, in one horrible moment, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the doors of the train opened with a hiss, welcoming a heavy wave of stale, freezing air from the platform. Second, Sally pulled herself up from her seat, stepping towards the door as swiftly as she could. And third, the unconscious man slipped from the bench, face-planting directly in Sally's path with a sickening thud, and causing her to trip, tumbling into the open doorway and dropping her book to the tracks below. Sally looked at the stranger on the floor in front of her and shrieked with utter terror. The back of his head was crusted with blood, surrounding a fresh bullet hole in the center of his skull. Moments before, Sally had locked eyes with a corpse and conversed with his killers. The man in the middle had been dead the whole time.
Got a problem? Just pick up the phone. It solved them all, and all in the same way. Everything was perfectly swell. There were no prisons, no slums, no insane asylums, no cripples, no poverty, no wars. All diseases were conquered, so was old age. Death, barring accidents, was an adventure for volunteers. The population of the United States was stabilized at 40 million souls. One bright morning, in the Chicago Lying-In Hospital, a man named Edward K. Whaling Jr. waited for his wife to give birth. He was the only man waiting. Not many people were born a day anymore. Whaling was 56, a mere stripling in the population whose average age was 129. X-rays had revealed that his wife was going to have triplets. The children would be his first. Young Whaling was hunched in his chair, his head in his hand. He was so rumpled, so still and colourless, as to be virtually invisible. His camouflage was perfect, since the waiting room had a disorderly and demoralised air too. Chairs and ashtrays had been moved away from the walls. The floor was paved with spattered drop cloths. The room was being redecorated. It was being redecorated as a memorial to a man who had volunteered to die. A sardonic old man, about 200 years old, sat on a stepladder, painting a mural he did not like. Back in the days when people aged visibly, his age would have been guessed at 35 or so. Aging had touched him that much before the cure for aging was found. The mural he was working on depicted a very neat garden. Men and women in white, doctors and nurses, turned the soil, planted seedlings, sprayed bugs, spread fertilizer. Men and women in purple uniforms pulled up weeds, cut down plants that were old and sickly, raked leaves, carried refuse to trash burners. Never, 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 not even in medieval Holland nor old Japan, had a garden been more formal, been better tended. Every plant had all the loam, light, water, air and nourishment it could use. A hospital orderly came down the corridor, singing under his breath a popular song. If you don't like my kisses, honey, here's what I will do. I'll go see a girl in purple, kiss this sad world toodaloo. If you don't want my loving, why should I take up all this space? I'll get off this whole planet, let some sweet baby have my place. The orderly looked in at the mural and the muralist. Looks so real, he said. I can practically imagine I'm standing in the middle of it. What makes you think you're not in it? Said the painter. He gave a satiric smile. It's called the happy garden of life, you know. That's good of Dr. Hitz, said the orderly. He was referring to one of the male figures in white, whose head was a portrait of Dr. Benjamin Hitz, the hospital's chief obstetrician. Hitz was a blindingly handsome man. Lots of faces to fill in, said the orderly. He meant that the faces of many of the figures in the mural were still blank. All blanks were to be filled with portraits of important people on either the hospital staff or from the Chicago office of the Federal Bureau of Termination. Must be nice to be able to make pictures that look like something, said the orderly. The painter's face curdled with scorn. You think I'm proud of this daub? He said. You think this is my idea of what life really looks like? What's your idea of what life looks like? Said the orderly. The painter gestured at a foul drop cloth. There's a good picture of it, he said. Frame that, and you'll have a picture a damn sight more honest than this one. You're a gloomy old duck, aren't you? Said the orderly. Is that a crime? Said the painter. The orderly shrugged. If you don't like it here, Grandpa, he said, and he finished the thought with the trick telephone number that people who didn't want to live anymore were supposed to call. The 0 in the telephone number he pronounced naught. The number was 2BR, naught 2B. It was the telephone number of an institution whose fanciful sobriquets included Automat, Birdland, Cannery, Catbox, Delouser, Easy Go, Goodbye, Mother, Happy Hooligan, Kiss Me Quick, Lucky Pierre, Sheep Dip, Wearing Blender, Weep No More, and Why Worry? To be or not to be was the telephone number of the municipal gas chambers of the Federal Bureau of Termination. The painter thumbed his nose at the orderly.
"When I decide it's time to go," he said, "it won't be at the Sheep Dip." "Do it yourself, said the orderly. "Messy business, Grandpa. Why don't you have a little consideration for the people who have to clean up after you?"
The painter expressed, with an obscenity, his lack of concern for the tribulations of his survivors.
"The world could do with a good deal more mess, if you ask me," he said.
The orderly laughed and moved on. Wailing, the waiting father mumbled something without raising his head, and then he fell silent again. A coarse, formidable woman strode into the waiting room on Spike Hills. Her shoes, stockings, trench coat, bag and overseas cap were all purple, the purple the painter called the colour of grapes of Judgment Day. The medallion of her purple musette bag was the seal of the Service Division of the Federal Bureau of Termination, an eagle perched on a turnstile. The woman had a lot of facial hair, and an unmistakable moustache in fact. A curious thing about gas chamber hostesses was that no matter how lovely and feminine they were when recruited, they all sprouted moustaches within 5 years or so. "Is this where I'm supposed to come?" she said to the painter.
"A lot would depend on what your business was," he said. "You aren't about to have a baby, are you?"
"They told me I was supposed to pose for some picture," she said. "My name's Leora Duncan."
She waited.
"And you dunk people?"
he said.
"What?"
she said.
"Skip it,"
he said.
"That sure is a beautiful picture," she said. "Looks just like heaven or something."
"Or something," said the painter. He took a list of names from his smock pocket. "Duncan, Duncan, Duncan," he said, scanning the list.
"Yes, here you are. You're entitled to be immortalized. See any faceless body here you'd like me to stick your head on? We've got a few choice ones left."
She studied the mural bleakly.
"Gee," she said, "they're all the same to me. I don't know anything about art."
"Body's a body,
he said.
"Alrighty. As a master of fine art, I recommend this body here."
He indicated a faceless figure of a woman who was carrying dried stalks to a trash burner.
"Well," said Leora Duncan, "that's more the disposal people, isn't it? I mean, I'm in service. I don't do any disposing."
The painter clapped his hands in mock delight.
"You say you don't know anything about art, and then you prove in the next breath that you know more about it than I do. Of course, the sheave carrier is wrong for a hostess. A snipper, a pruner, that's more your line."
He pointed to a figure in purple who was sawing a dead branch from an apple tree.
"How about her?" he said. "You like her at all?"
"Gosh,"
she said, and she blushed and became humble.
That puts me right next to Dr. Hitz."
"That upsets you?" he said.
"Oh, good gravy, no," she said. It's just such an honor."
"Ah, you admire him, he said.
"Who doesn't admire him?" she said,
worshipping the portrait of Hitz. It was the portrait of a tanned, white-haired, omnipotent Zeus, 240 years old. "Who doesn't admire him?" she said again.
"He was responsible for setting up the very first gas chamber in Chicago."
"Nothing would please me more," said the painter, "than to put you next to him for all time. Sawing off a limb. That strikes you as appropriate?"
"That is kind of like what I do," she said.
She was demure about what she did. What she did was make people comfortable when she killed them. And while Leora Duncan was posing for her portrait, into the waiting room bounded Dr. Hitz himself. He was 7 feet tall and he boomed with importance, accomplishments, and the joy of living. "Well, Miss Duncan," he said, and he made a joke. "What are you doing here?" he said. "This isn't where the people leave, this is where they come in." "We're going to be in the same picture together," she said shyly. "Good," said Dr. Hitz heartily. "And say, isn't that some picture?" "I sure am honored to be in it with you," she said. "Let me tell you," he said, "I'm honored to be in it with you. Without women like you, this wonderful world we've got wouldn't be possible." He saluted her and moved toward the door that led to the delivery rooms. "Guess what was just born?" he said. "I can't," she said. "Triplets," he said. "Triplets," she said. She was exclaiming over the legal implications of triplets. The law said that no newborn child could survive unless the parents of the child could find someone who would volunteer to die. Triplets, if they were all to live, called for 3 volunteers. "Do the parents have 3 volunteers?" said Leora Duncan. "Last I heard," said Dr. Hitz, "they had 1 and were trying to scrape another 2 up." "I don't think they made it," she said. "Nobody made 3 appointments with us. Nothing but singles going through today, unless somebody called in after I left." "What's the name?" "Whaling," said the waiting father, sitting up, red-eyed and frowsy. "Edward K. Whaling, Jr. is the name of the happy father-to-be." He raised his right hand, looked at a spot on the wall, gave a hoarsely wretched chuckle. "Present," he said. "Ah, Mr. Whaling," said Dr. Hitz. "I didn't see you." "The Invisible Man," said Whaling. "They just phoned me that your triplets have been born," said Dr. Hitz. "They're all fine, and so is the mother. I'm on my way in to see them now." "Hooray," said Whaling emptily. "You don't sound very happy," said Dr. Hitz. "What man in my shoes wouldn't be happy?" said Whaling. He gestured with his hands to symbolize carefree simplicity. "All I have to do is pick out which one of the triplets is going to live, then deliver my maternal grandfather to the happy hooligan and come back here with a receipt." Dr. Hitz became rather severe with Whaling, towered over him. "You don't believe in population control, Mr. Whaling?" he said. "I think it's perfectly keen," said Whaling tautly. "Would you like to go back to the good old days when the population of the Earth was 20 billion, about to become 40 billion, then 80 billion, then 160 billion? Do you know what a druplet is, Mr. Whaling?" said Hitz. "Nope," said Whaling sulkily. "A druplet, Mr. Whaling, is one of the little knobs on the little pulpy grains of a blackberry," said Dr. Hitz. "Without population control, human beings would now be packed on this surface of this old planet like druplets on a blackberry. Think of it." Whaling continued to stare at the same spot on the wall. "In the year 2000, said Dr. Hitz, "before scientists stepped in and laid down the law, there wasn't even enough drinking water to go round, and nothing to eat but seaweed, and still people insisted on their right to reproduce like jackrabbits, and their right, if possible, to live forever." "I want those kids," said Whaling quietly. "I want all 3 of them." "Of course you do," said Dr. Hitz. "That's only human." "I don't want my grandfather to die either," said Whaling. "Nobody's really happy about taking a close relative to the cat box," said Dr. Hitz, gently, sympathetically. "I wish people wouldn't call it that," said Leora Duncan. "What?" said Dr. Hitz. "I wish people wouldn't call it the cat box and things like that," she said. "It gives people the wrong impression." "Oh, you're absolutely right," said Dr. Hitz. "Forgive me," he corrected himself, gave the municipal gas chambers their official title, a title no one ever used in conversation. "I should have said Ethical Suicide Studios," he said. "That sounds much better," said Leora Duncan. "This child of yours, whichever one you decide to keep, Mr. Whaling," said Dr. Hitz, "he or she is going to live on a happy, roomy, clean, rich planet thanks to population control, in a garden like that mural there." He shook his head. 2 centuries ago, when I was a young man, it was a hell that nobody thought could last another 20 years.
Now centuries of peace and plenty stretch before us as far as the imagination cares to travel. He smiled luminously. The smile faded as he saw that Welling had just drawn a revolver. Whaling shot Dr. Hitz dead.
There's room for one, a great big one, he said.
And then he shot Leora Duncan.
It's only death,
he said to her as she fell.
There, room for two.
And then he shot himself, making room for all three of his children. Nobody came running. Nobody seemingly heard the shots. The painter sat on the top of his stepladder, looking down reflectively on the sorry scene. The painter pondered the mournful puzzle of life demanding to be born, and, once born, demanding to be fruitful, to multiply, to live as long as possible, to do all that on a very small planet that would have to last forever. All the answers that the painter could think of were grim, even grimmer, surely, than a cat box, a happy hooligan, an easy go. He thought of war, he thought of plague, he thought of starvation. He knew that he would never paint again. He let his paintbrush fall to the drop cloths below, and then he decided he had had about enough of life and the happy garden of life too, and he came slowly down from the ladder. He took Welling's pistol, really intending to shoot himself, but he didn't have the nerve. And then he saw the telephone booth in the corner of the room. He went to it, dialed the well-remembered number, 2BR0 2B. Federal Bureau of Termination, said the very warm voice of the hostess.
How soon could I get an appointment?
He asked, speaking very carefully. We could probably fit you in late this afternoon, sir, she said. It might even be earlier if we get a cancellation.
All right,
said the painter.
fit me in, if you please.
And he gave her his name, spelling it out. Thank you, sir, said the hostess. Your city thanks you, your country thanks you, your planet thanks you, but the deepest thanks of all is from future generations.
In the bosom of a spacious cove on the eastern shore of the Hudson, there lies a small market port, which is generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, murmuring just enough to lull one to rest, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker, the only sounds that ever break the uniform tranquility. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all of the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was cursed by a witch doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others swore that it was long used as a gathering place for indigenous tribes, and a prophet bewitched the soil when it was stolen from them by the settlers. To this day, the place still continues under the sway of dark powers that hold the minds of good people in trance or visions, and they frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. Meteors glare and stars shoot more often across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. The most often seen spirit that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a man on horseback without a head. Some say he's the ghost of a fallen soldier whose head had been carried away by a cannonball during battle, now hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. It is alleged that his body was buried in the local churchyard, and his ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle each night on a quest for his missing head, passing along the hollow like a midnight blast, in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Within the small town there lived a man by the name of Ichabod Crane, who had moved to Sleepy Hollow to instruct the local children. He was tall and lank, with narrow shoulders and long arms and legs. His hands dangled a mile from his sleeves, and his feet could have served as shovels. To see him striding along the hill on a windy day, his frame so loosely hung together with his clothes fluttering about, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow escaped from the cornfield. The schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old school books. The low murmur of children's voices could be heard on a drowsy summer's day like the hum of a beehive, only interrupted by the authoritative voice of their instructor. The revenue from the school was small and insufficient to furnish Ichabod, for he had a large appetite and the feeding powers of an anaconda. Thus, all of his belongings were tied up into a cotton handkerchief, and he lived for 1 week at a time at the houses of the children he taught. It was often his delight, after school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself with a good book on the rich bed of clover by the stream near the schoolhouse, until the gathering dusk made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he made his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered that week, every sound of nature, at that witching hour, fluttered his excited imagination. Ichabod was known to pass long winter evenings with the local wives by the fire, listening to spluttering apples roasting on the hearth and their tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and houses, cursed bridges and brooks, and particularly the Headless Horseman. But of course, no spectre dared show his face in the glow of a crackling fire, and there was a pleasure in all of this, snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber. But in the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night, the subsequent walk homewards was filled with fearful shapes and shadows across his path. Ichabod found himself frightened by a shrub covered in snow, like a sheeted spectre, and he shrank in curdling terror at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet. With a shivering voice, he recited a psalm in a low, sing-song tone. Dread prevented him from looking back over his shoulder, and he was thrown into hysterics at any rushing blast of wind howling among the trees, in the idea that it could be the Headless Horseman trampling close behind. But these were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness, and Ichabod would have passed a pleasant life of it if his path had not been crossed by Katrina Van Tassel. Katrina was a blooming lass of nearly 20, universally famed for her beauty and expectations. She expertly mixed ancient and modern fashions and wore ornaments of pure yellow gold which had been passed down from her great-great-grandmother. It was no surprise that Ichabod had found favor in his eyes for her after visiting her mansion. Katrina's father was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer, and his property was situated in a green, sheltered, fertile nook along the banks of the Hudson. Ichabod's great green eyes rolled over the fat meadow lands, rich with wheat, rye, buckwheat, and corn, with orchards bursting with red fruit, and his heart yearned after the woman who would inherit these domains, and his peace of mind was at an end. Ichabod's only goal was to gain the affections of Katrina, though he was one of many admirers. Among them, the most formidable was a burly man with thick, curly black hair, by the name of Brom van Brunt, broad-shouldered and double-jointed with an air of arrogance. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, foremost at all races and cockfights, and the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with a tone that allowed for no appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but for all his overbearing roughness, there was a dash of good humor at the bottom, and he was known far and wide by the name of Brom Bones. With Brom's toyings like the gentle caresses of a bear, Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gentle manner, and serving as an instructor of music, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. From the moment Ichabod made his advances, a deadly feud arose between him and Brom Bones, who enlisted his gang of rough riders to smoke out the schoolhouse by stopping up the chimney and turning everything inside topsy-turvy so that Ichabod would think the building was used by witches at night. On one fine autumn afternoon, a man came clattering up to the school door with an invitation for Ichabod to attend a party at the Van Tassel mansion. He turned the school loose an hour before the usual time, and spent at least an hour brushing and washing and furbishing up his only suit of rusty black, fixing his messy hair in the reflection of a broken schoolhouse window. He borrowed a horse from a friendly farmer and issued forth like a knight on a quest for adventure. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while the more tender trees had been nipped by frost into brilliant shades of orange, purple, and scarlet. As Ichabod rode slowly on his way, his eye ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn, and soft anticipation stole over his mind of buttered pastries garnished with honey by the delicate and dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the mansion. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having arrived on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one else could manage. The farmer greeted his guests with good humor, his face round and jolly as the harvest moon. When the sound of music from the ballroom summoned them all to dance, Ichabod was overjoyed to find Katrina as his partner, and he smiled graciously in reply to the many ogling eyes, while Brom Bones sat brooding by himself in the corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod wandered to the far side of the piazza, where a group sat smoking and gossiping over former times and sharing stories of ghosts and apparitions. Tales were told of funeral trains, and weeping cries and wailings heard near the great haunted tree where many had died. There was mention of the woman in white, who was said to have perished long ago in the snow, and can now be heard shrieking in the winds of winter storms. Before long, the subject was the Headless Horseman, who had been seen or heard many times of late before returning to his resting place in the churchyard. The church itself stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was an old wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime. It was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and where he was most frequently encountered. Brombones made light of the spirit, affirming that one night upon returning from a neighboring village, he'd been overtaken by the midnight trooper. He'd offered to race the horseman, and he should have won it too, but just as they came to the old wooden bridge, the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton and vanished in a flash of fire. The party gradually broke up, and families gathered together in their wagons, heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Ichabod lingered behind in hopes of a private moment with Katrina, fully convinced that he was on the road to success. But something must have gone wrong, for quite suddenly he left the mansion and went straight for the stable, rousing his borrowed steed uncourteously from his sleep and pursuing his travels homewards. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, rode along the lofty hills above Tarrytown, where he had traveled so cheerily in the afternoon. In the dead hush of midnight, all the stories of ghosts and goblins came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky and clouds. He was approaching the very place of many of the stories, where an enormous tulip tree towered above all the others like a kind of landmark. As Ichabod approached this fearful spot, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast of wind sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the white wood laid bare, having been scathed by lightning. Suddenly he heard a horrible groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees gripped against the saddle. But it was only the rubbing of one huge branch upon another as they swayed about by the breeze. A small brook crossed the road near the tree, running into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He gave his horse a kick in the ribs and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge, but instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal plunged to the opposite side of the road, into a thicket of brambles and bushes. The beast dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a halt just by the brook, with a suddenness that nearly sent Ichabod flying over his head. Just at this moment, in the dark shadow of the grove, on the edge of the brook, there lingered something huge, misshapen and towering, like a gigantic monster awaiting him. Ichabod knew to turn and fly now was too late, and besides, how could he escape a ghost that could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning his courage, Ichabod demanded, "Who are you?" but received no reply. He repeated his demand in a more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible horse, involuntarily breaking into the psalm he'd sang before, when the shadowy object put itself into motion, bounding to the middle of the road. Now the form could be seen in some degree. He was a massive horseman, mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. Ichabod's horse had seemingly gotten over his fright, and he quickened the steed in hopes of leaving the spirit behind. The horsemen, however, matched their pace. So Ichabod pulled back and fell into a walk, hoping to lag behind, but the horseman did the same. His heart began to sink. There was something so mysterious and appalling about the silence of his newfound companion, which was soon accounted for. Upon mounting the rising ground, his fellow traveler found relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in cloak, and Ichabod was horror-struck to see that he was headless. His head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on his saddle. Ichabod's terror rose to desperation, and he rained a shower of kicks and blows upon the horse, hoping to somehow give his companion the slip. But the headless horseman stuck with him. They dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lanky body over his horse's head in the eagerness of flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Ichabod's horse seemed possessed by a demon. Plunging headlong down the road which leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees, where it crosses the old wooden bridge before swelling into the green knoll that held the church. Just as Ichabod got halfway through the hollow, the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping around the horse's neck, when the saddle fell to the earth, trampled underfoot by his pursuer. Ichabod could hardly maintain his seat, slipping violently from one side to another, jolted painfully on the high ridge of the horse's backbone. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The shimmering reflection of the moon on the brook told him that he was not mistaken. If I can reach that bridge, Ichabod thought, I am safe. But the black steed was panting and blowing close behind him, tickling his neck with hot breath. With another kick, the horse sprang upon the bridge, thundering over the resounding planks to the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to the story, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Yet the massive horseman still approached, rising in his stirrups, and hurled his head at Ichabod. With a tremendous crash, Ichabod tumbled headlong into the dust as his horse galloped away, and the headless horseman passed by him like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast nor dinner. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle, trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, where the water ran deep and black, they found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close to it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but Ichabod's body would not be discovered. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. They considered the tales of ghosts and apparitions, and shook their heads, concluding that Ichabod had been carried off by the headless horseman. Some believed Ichabod, mortified by Katrina's sudden dismissal, left for quarters in a distant part of the country. Shortly after his disappearance, Brom Bones met a blooming Katrina at the altar, and they married. At the festival that followed, Brom was observed to look exceedingly knowing when the story of Ichabod was mentioned, and he burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, and some believed he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. As Ichabod had no family, nobody troubled their head any more about him, and the school was shuttered, removed to the other end of the hollow, where another schoolmaster reigned in his absence. The deserted building fell into decay, and was nearly forgotten, when on one drowsy summer's day, a pair of boys heard the low murmur of a man's voice from outside, like the hum of a beehive. And as they approached the broken glass windows,
they swore they beheld a tall and lanky ghost, lowly singing the tune of a melancholy psalm among the tranquil solitude of Sleepy Hollow.
It was just 20 years ago, and I had been out all day hunting with no sport to speak of, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm fluttering down, and the evening closing in. Not the faintest sign of life met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing to do but walk on, and take my chance of finding shelter. The snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. The cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. My heart grew heavy as I thought of my young wife watching for me through the window, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. Even now, weary as I was, I felt I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. A wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God," was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" he growled. "Well, for you. I've been lost in the snow. How far am I now from Dwalding?" "A good 20 miles, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is about 12 miles the other direction." "Where do you live, then? Please, let me go with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "'Tain't no use," he growled. "The master won't let you in." "Who is the master?" The gnome-like man was hobbling away through the falling snow. "You lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter." "You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. Once inside, I found myself in a great raftered hall. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural tools, casks, and all kinds of lumber, while overhead hung hams, baskets, and bunches of dried herbs. In the center of the floor stood some huge object gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude, movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned, the speculum at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin. He pointed to a low black door at the opposite of the hall. I crossed over and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table, covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "What do you want?" I told him I simply sought sustenance and sleep. "Jacob, how dare you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "By what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same that gives the right to cling to your boat when drowning. Self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "The snow would cover my body before daybreak." The man strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay till morning." With this he waved me to a seat and resumed his studies. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. The room was carpetless. The walls were scrawled over with strange diagrams and covered with crowded shelves of philosophical instruments. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase, on the other a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw geological specimens, crucibles, and jars of chemicals, while on the shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps and papers. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of sherry were placed before me. "I have little to offer you, sir," said my host. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for our deficiencies." I protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He sat down to his own supper, which consisted of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and, turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of the outer world?" I encouraged his interrogation, and he bent his head in acknowledgement, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, but I was no student of science. I was much relieved when he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. I listened, spellbound. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. He poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. "The world," he said, "rejects as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory. Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various as the belief in apparitions, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the Christian, the pagan. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by philosophers. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool." He relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands and added, "I was branded a visionary, ridiculed by my contemporaries, and banished from the field I'd given all the best years of my life. Since then, I have lived as you see me now. The world has forgotten me, and I have forgotten the world." He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. "It has ceased snowing," he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Oh, if it were only possible," I said. "But even if I could find my way, I could not walk 20 miles tonight." "Tonight?" repeated my host. "Are you so very anxious? What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently, "who does not know that I have lost my way." "Where is she?" "At Dwalding, 20 miles away." "Dwalding," he echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, that's 20 miles. Then he smiled. "The night mail from the north changes horses at Dwalding. They pass within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you, you could find your way, I suppose?" "Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight." I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and would have shaken hands, but he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out in the bitter cold. Not a star glimmered, not a sound save the crunching beneath our feet disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob shambled on in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed, gun over my shoulder. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears and held my imagination captive. I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Yon's the old coach road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand. And how far do I go before the crossroads? About 3 miles. It's a fair enough road for foot passengers, but too steep and narrow for traffic. Mind where the wall is broken away near the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident. What accident? The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, 50 feet or so. 4 were found dead, and the other 2 died the next morning. How long is it since this happened? Just 9 years. Near the signpost, you say. I will bear it in mind. Good night. I tipped the man, and he thanked me before trudging back the way we came. I watched his lantern till the light disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. A strange sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. Meanwhile, the night became colder, and even though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. I even breathed with difficulty, as though I was scaling the heights of some mountain. I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant light. It must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seems strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads by mistake, and that this was the very coach I had come to meet? It came round the bend of the road, wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out, like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The coachman pulled up. The guard neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, and slipped into the vacant corner. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked at my fellow passengers, all 3 men, and all silent. Each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. How intensely cold it is tonight, I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew. Now I saw that every part of the coach was in a condition of decay, crusted over with mold, and literally rotting. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and he moved his head slowly and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid, and his bloodless lips were drawn back as if in agony, showing gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a dreadful horror came upon me. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He too was looking at me, with the same pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw that he was no living man. None of them were living men. Pale light played upon their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by landing upon a deep snowdrift. I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to aid my broken arm and fractured skull. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events, but she treated the adventure as a mere dream, born of the fever in my brain. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach.
I had not been settled much more than 6 weeks in my country practice when I was sent to a neighbouring town to consult on a case of a very dangerous illness. Looking to hire a gig for my return home as cheaply as possible, I sought out an unpretentious inn. The one I found was dingy and quiet, with an old-fashioned sign that had evidently not been repainted for many years past. The landlord was not above making a small profit, and as soon as we came to terms, he rang the yard bell to order the gig. "Has Robert not come back from the errand?" he asked, appealing to the waiter who answered the bell. "No, sir, he hasn't." "Well then, you must wake up Isaac." "Wake up Isaac?" I repeated. "That sounds rather odd. Do your ostlers go to bed in the daytime?" "This one does," said the landlord, smiling to himself in a rather strange way. "And dreams too," added the waiter. "Never you mind about that," retorted his master. "You go and rouse Isaac up. The gentleman's waiting for his gig." "Stop a minute," I interposed. "I have rather a fancy for seeing this man before you wake him. I'm a doctor, and if this queer sleeping and dreaming of his comes from anything wrong in his brain, I may be able to tell you what to do with him." "I rather think you'll find his complaint past all doctoring, sir," said the landlord. "But if you'd like to see him, you're welcome, I'm sure." He led the way across a yard to the stables, opened one of the doors, and waiting outside himself told me to look in. I found myself in a 2-stall stable. In one of the stalls, an old man was lying asleep on a litter. I stooped and looked at him attentively. It was a withered, woebegone face. The hollow, wrinkled cheeks and the scanty, grizzled hair told their own tale of past sorrow or suffering. He was drawing his breath convulsively when I first looked at him, and in a moment more, he began to talk in his sleep. "No, wake up," I heard him say. "Wake up there! Murder!" He moved one lean arm slowly till it rested over his throat, shuddered a little, and turned on the straw. Then the arm left his throat, the hand stretched itself out and clutched at the side towards which he had turned, as if he fancied himself to be grasping at the edge of something. "Light grey eyes," he murmured, "and a droop in the left eyelid. Flaxen hair with a gold-yellow streak in it. All right, mother. Fair white arms with a down on them. Little lady's hand with a reddish look under the fingernails. You she-devil! Where's the knife?" I saw him shudder on the straw. His withered face became distorted, and he threw up both his hands with a quick, hysterical gasp. They struck against the bottom of the manger under which he lay, and the blow awakened him. I had just time to slip through the door before his eyes were fully open and his senses his own again. "Do you know anything about this man's past life?" I said to the landlord. "Yes, sir. I know pretty well all about it," was the answer. "And an uncommon queer story it is. Why, just look at him. Poor devil, he's so worn out with these restless nights he's dropped back into his sleep already." "Don't wake him," I said. "I'm in no hurry for the gig. Wait till the other man comes back from his errand. And in the meantime, suppose I have some lunch and a bottle of sherry, and suppose you come and help me to get through it, The heart of mine host, as I had anticipated, warmed to me over his own wine. He soon became communicative on the subject of the man asleep in the stable, and little by little I drew the whole story out of him. It seems that some years ago there lived in the suburbs of a large seaport town on the west coast of England a man of humble circumstances by the name of Isaac Scatchard. His means of subsistence were derived from any employment he could get as an ostler, and occasionally, when times went well with him, from temporary engagements in service as stable helper in private houses. Though a faithful, steady, and honest man, he got on badly in his calling. His ill luck was proverbial among his neighbours. He was always missing good opportunities by no fault of his own, and Unlucky Isaac was his nickname in his own neighbourhood. When he was out of service, he lived alone with his widowed mother, who contrived to provide for her simple wants by doing rough work for the tailors, and always managed to keep a decent home for her son to return to whenever his ill luck drove him out helpless into the world. One bleak autumn, when Isaac was getting on towards 40, and when he was, as usual, out of place through no fault of his own, he set forth from his mother's cottage on a long walk inland to a gentleman's seat, where he had heard that a stable helper was required. It wanted then but 2 days of his birthday, and Mrs. Scatchard, with her usual fondness, made him promise before he started that he would be back in time to keep that anniversary with her in as festive a way as their poor means would allow. It was easy for him to comply with this request, even supposing he slept a night each way on the road. He was to start from home on Monday morning, and whether he got the new place or not, he was to be back for his birthday dinner on Wednesday at 2 o'clock. Arriving at his destination too late on the Monday night to make application for the stable helper's place, he slept at the village inn, and in good time, on the Tuesday morning, presented himself at the gentleman's house to fill the vacant situation. Here again his ill luck pursued him as inexorably as ever. His long walk had been in vain. Only the day before, the stable helper's place had been given to another man. Isaac accepted this new disappointment resignedly, and as a matter of course. He set forth on his homeward journey and walked all day with only one stoppage for bread and cheese. Just as it was getting towards dark, the rain came on and the wind began to rise, and he found himself stopping at a lonely roadside inn for the night. At a little after 11, the house was closed, and Isaac went round with the landlord holding the candle while the doors and lower windows were being secured. He noticed with surprise the strength of the bolts, bars, and iron-sheathed shutters. "You see, we are rather lonely here," said the landlord. "We never had any attempts made to break in yet, but it's always as well to be on the safe side." It was 11:30 by the clock in the passage as they went upstairs to the bedroom, the window of which looked out onto the wood at the back of the house. "Oh, here's where you're to sleep," said the landlord. "You're the only lodger tonight, and I think you'll say my missus has done her best to make you comfortable." Isaac locked the door, set his candle on the chest of drawers, and wearily got ready for bed. The bleak autumn wind was still blowing, and Isaac resolved as he lay down to keep the candle alight until he began to grow sleepy, for there was something unendurably depressing in the bare idea of lying awake in the darkness, listening to the dismal, ceaseless moan of the wind in the wood. Sleep stole on him before he was aware of it. His eyes closed, and he fell off insensibly to rest, without having so much as thought of extinguishing the candle. In one moment he passed from a state of sleep to a state of wakefulness, his eyes wide open, his mental perceptions cleared on a sudden as if by a miracle. The candle had burnt down nearly to the last morsel of tallow, but the top of the unsnuffed wick had just fallen off, and the light in the little room was for the moment fair and full. Between the foot of the bed and the closed door, there stood a woman with a knife in her hand looking at him. He was stricken with terror. The woman said not a word as they stared each other in the face, but she began to move slowly towards the left-hand side of the bed. She was a fair, fine woman, with yellowish flaxen hair and light grey eyes, with a droop in the left eyelid. Speechless, with no expression in her face, with no noise following her footfall, she came closer and closer, stopped, and slowly raised the knife. He laid his right arm over his throat to save it, but as he saw the knife coming down, threw his hand across the bed to the right side and jerked his body over that way, just as the knife descended on the mattress within an inch of his shoulder. His eyes fixed on her arm and hand as she slowly drew the knife out of the bed. A white, well-shaped arm, with a pretty down lying lightly over the fair skin. A delicate lady's hand with the crowning beauty of a pink flush under and round the fingernails. She drew the knife out and passed back again slowly to the foot of the bed, stopped there for a moment looking at him, then came on, still speechless, still with no expression on the beautiful face, still with no sound following the stealthy footfalls, came on to the right side of the bed where he now lay. As she approached, she raised the knife again, and he drew himself away to the left side. She struck, as before, right into the mattress with a deliberate, perpendicularly downward action of the arm. This time, his eyes wandered from her to the knife. It was like the large clasp knives, which he had often seen labouring men use to cut their bread and bacon with. Her delicate little fingers did not conceal more than 2/3 of the handle. He noticed that it was made of buckhorn, clean and shining as the blade was, and looking like new. For the second time she drew the knife out, concealed it in the wide sleeve of her gown, then stopped by the bedside, watching him. For an instant he saw her standing in that position. Then the wick of the spent candle fell over into the socket. The flame diminished to a little blue point, and the room grew dark. A moment, or less if possible, passed so, and then the wick flamed up smokily for the last time. His eyes were still looking eagerly over the right-hand side of the bed when the final flash of light came, but they discerned nothing. The fair woman with the knife was gone. With the dreadful conviction of what he had seen still strong within him, he leapt out of bed and screaming, "Murder! Wake up there! Wake up!" dashed headlong through the darkness to the door. It was fast locked, exactly as he had left it on going to bed. His cries on starting up had alarmed the house. He heard the terrified, confused exclamations of women. He saw the master of the house approaching along the passage with his burning rush candle in one hand and his gun in the other. "What is it?" asked the landlord breathlessly. Isaac could only answer in a whisper. A woman with a knife in her hand. In my room. A fair, yellow-haired woman. She jabbed at me with a knife twice over. The landlord looked at Isaac by the flickering light of his candle. Well, she seems to have missed you twice, he said. I dodged the knife as it came down, Isaac went on. It struck the bed each time. The landlord took his candle into the bedroom. In less than a minute he came out again into the passage in a violent passion. The devil fly away with you and your woman with the knife. There isn't a mark in the bedclothes anywhere. What do you mean by coming into a man's place and frightening his family out of their wits by a dream? I'll leave your house, said Isaac faintly. Better out on the road in rain and dark on my way home than back again in that room after what I've seen in it. Lend me a light to get my clothes by and tell me what I'm to pay. Pay? Cried the landlord, leading the way with his light sulkily into the bedroom. You'll find your score on the slate when you go downstairs. I wouldn't have taken you in for all the money you got about you if I'd known your dreaming, screeching ways beforehand. Look at the bed. Where's the cut of a knife in it? Look at the window. Is the lock busted? Look at the door, which I heard you fasten yourself. Is it broke in? A murdering woman with a knife in my house. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Isaac answered not a word. He huddled on his clothes, and then they went down the stairs together. Nigh on 20 minutes past 2, said the landlord as they passed the clock. A nice time in the morning to frighten honest people out of their wits. Isaac paid his bill, and the landlord let him out at the front door. The rain had ceased, but the night was dark and the wind bleaker than ever. Little did the darkness or the cold matter to Isaac. If he had been turned out into the wilderness in a thunderstorm, it would have been a relief after what he had suffered in the bedroom of the inn. What was the fair woman with the knife? The creature of a dream? Or that other creature from the unknown world called among men by the name of Ghost? He could make nothing of the mystery, had made nothing of it, even when it was midday on Wednesday and when he stood at last once more on the doorstep of home. His mother came out eagerly to receive him. His face told her in a moment that something was wrong. I've lost the place, but that's my luck. I dreamed an ill dream last night, Mother. Or maybe I saw a ghost. Take it either way, it scared me out of my senses, and I'm not my own man again yet. Isaac, your face frightens me. Come into the fire. Come in and tell Mother all about it. He was as anxious to tell her as she was to hear, for it had been his hope all the way home that his mother, with her quicker capacity and superior knowledge, might be able to throw some light on the mystery which he could not clear up for himself. His mother's face grew paler and paler as he went on. She never interrupted him by so much as a single word, but when he had done, she moved her chair close to his, put her arm around his neck and said to him, Isaac, you dreamed your ill dream on this Wednesday morning. What time was it when you saw the fair woman with the knife in her hand? Isaac reflected and answered, somewhere about 2 o'clock in the morning. His mother struck her hands together with a gesture of despair. This Wednesday is your birthday, Isaac, and 2 o'clock in the morning is the time when you were born. Isaac's capacities were not quick enough to catch the infection of his mother's superstitious dread. He was amazed and a little startled also when she suddenly rose from her chair, opening her old writing desk, took pen, ink, and paper, and then said to him, Your memory's but a poor one, Isaac, and now I am an old woman. Mine's not much better. I want all about this dream of yours to be as well known to both of us years hence as it is now. Tell me over again all you told me a minute ago when you spoke of what the woman with the knife looked like. Isaac obeyed, and marveled much as he saw his mother carefully set down on paper the very words that he was saying. Light grey eyes, she wrote, with a droop in her left eyelid, flaxen hair with a yellow gold streak in it, white arms with a down upon them, little lady's hands with a reddish look about the fingernails, clasp knife with a buckhorn handle that seemed as good as new. Mrs. Scatchard added the year, month, day of the week, and time in the morning when the woman of the dream appeared to her son. She then locked up the paper carefully in her writing desk. Neither on that day nor on any day after could her son induce her to return to the matter of the dream. She obstinately kept her thoughts about it to herself and even refused to refer again to the paper in her writing desk. Ere long, Isaac grew weary of attempting to make her break her resolute silence, and time gradually wore out the impression produced on him by the dream. He began by thinking of it carelessly, and he ended by not thinking of it at all. This result was the more easily brought about by the advent of some important changes for the better in his prospects. He reaped at last the reward of his long and patient suffering under adversity by getting an excellent place, keeping it for 7 years, and leaving it, on the death of his master, not only with an excellent character, but also with a comfortable annuity bequeathed to him as a reward for saving his mistress's life in a carriage accident. Thus it happened that Isaac Scatchard returned to his old mother 7 years after the time of the dream at the inn, with an annual sum of money at his disposal, sufficient to keep them both in ease and independence for the rest of their lives. The mother, whose health had been bad of late years, profited so much by the care bestowed on her and by freedom from money anxieties that when Isaac's birthday came round, she was able to sit up comfortably at table and dine with him. On that day, as the evening drew on, Mrs. Scatchard discovered that a bottle of tonic medicine, which she was accustomed to take, happened to be empty. Isaac immediately volunteered to go to the chemist's and get it filled again. It was a rainy, bleak night, and on going into the chemist's shop he was passed hurriedly by a poorly dressed woman coming out of it. The glimpse he had of her face struck him, and he looked back after her as she descended the doorsteps. "You're noticing that woman?" said the chemist's apprentice behind the counter. "It's my opinion there's something wrong with her. She's been asking for laudanum to put on a bad tooth. Master's out for half an hour, and I told her I wasn't allowed to sell poison to strangers in his absence. She laughed in a queer way and said she would come back in half an hour. If she expects Master to serve her, I think she'd be disappointed. It's a case of suicide, sir, if ever there was one yet." These words added immeasurably to the sudden interest of the woman which Isaac had felt at the first sight of her face. After he'd got the medicine bottle filled, he looked about anxiously for her as soon as he was out on the street. She was walking slowly up and down on the opposite side of the road. With his heart, very much to his own surprise, beating fast, Isaac crossed over and spoke to her. He asked if she was in any distress. She pointed to her torn shawl, her scanty dress, her crushed, dirty bonnet, then moved under a lamp so as to let the light fall on her stern, pale, but still most beautiful face. "I look like a comfortable, happy woman, don't I?" she said with a bitter laugh. She spoke with a purity of intonation which Isaac had never heard before from other than ladies' lips. Her slightest action seemed to have the easy, negligent grace of a thoroughbred woman. Her skin, for all its poverty-stricken paleness, was as delicate as if her life had been passed in the enjoyment of every social comfort that wealth can purchase. Even her small, finely shaped hands, gloveless as they were, had not lost their whiteness. Little by little, in answer to his questions, the sad story of the woman came out. There is no need to relate it here. It is told over and over again in police reports and paragraphs descriptive of attempted suicides. "My name is Rebecca Murdoch," said the woman as she ended. "I have 9 pence left, and I thought of spending it at the chemist's over the way and securing a passage to the other world. Whatever it is, it can't be worse to me than this, so why should I stop here?" Besides the natural compassion and sadness moved in his heart by what he heard, Isaac felt within him some mysterious influence at work all the time the woman was speaking, which utterly confused his ideas and almost deprived him of his powers of speech. All that he could say in answer to her last reckless words was that he would prevent her from attempting her own life if he followed her about all night to do it. His rough, trembling earnestness seemed to impress her. "I won't occasion you that trouble," she answered. "You have given me a fancy for living by speaking kindly to me." Isaac was hopelessly taken with the poor woman, and a few more stolen interviews after that first meeting completed his infatuation. In less than a month, he had consented to give Rebecca Murdoch a new interest in existence and a chance of recovering the character she had lost by promising to make her his wife. There was only one thing wanting to perfect his happiness. At their first meeting, there had been mingled with his admiration when he looked in her face a faint, involuntary feeling of doubt whether that face was entirely strange to him. He announced his marriage engagement precipitately and confusedly to his mother on the day when he contracted it. Poor Mrs. Scatchard showed her perfect confidence in her son by flinging her arms around his neck and giving him joy of having found at last a woman to comfort and care for him after his mother was gone. She was all eagerness to see the woman of her son's choice, and the next day was fixed for the introduction. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the little cottage parlour was full of light as Mrs. Scatchard, happy and expectant, dressed for the occasion in her Sunday gown, sat waiting for her son and her future daughter-in-law. Punctual to the appointed time, Isaac hurriedly and nervously led his promised wife into the room. His mother rose to receive her, advanced a few steps, smiling, looked Rebecca full in the eyes, and suddenly stopped. Her face, which had been flushed the moment before, turned white in an instant. Her eyes lost their expression of softness and kindness and assumed a blank look of terror. Her outstretched hands fell to her sides, and she staggered back a few steps with a low cry to her son. "Isaac," she whispered, clutching him fast by the arm. "Isaac, does that woman's face remind you of nothing?" Before he could answer, before he could look round to where Rebecca stood, astonished and angered by her reception, his mother pointed impatiently to her writing desk and gave him the key. "Open it," she said in a quick, breathless whisper. "What does this mean? Why am I being treated as if I had no business here?" asked Rebecca angrily. "Open it, and give me the paper in the left-hand drawer. Quick, quick, for heaven's sake," said Mrs. Scatchard. Isaac gave her the paper. She looked it over eagerly for a moment, then followed Rebecca, who was now turning away haughtily to leave the room, and caught her by the shoulder, abruptly raised the long, loose sleeve of her gown, and glanced at her hand and arm. Something like fear began to steal over the angry expression on Rebecca's face as she shook herself free from the old woman's grasp and left the room. Isaac was hastening after her when his mother turned and stopped him. "Light grey eyes," she said, "a droop in the left eyelid, flaxen hair with a gold streak in it, white arms with a down on them, little lady's hands with a reddish look under the fingernails. The dream woman, Isaac, the dream woman." The faint, cleaving doubt, which he had never been able to shake off in Rebecca Murdoch's presence, was fatally set at rest forever. He had seen her face then before, 7 years before, on his birthday, in the bedroom of the lonely inn. "Be warned, oh my son, be warned. Isaac, Isaac, let her go, and do you stop with me?" Something darkened the parlour window as those words were said. A sudden chill ran through Isaac, and he glanced sidelong at the shadow. Rebecca Murdoch had come back. She was peering in at them over the low window blind. "I have promised to marry, Mother," he said. "And marry I must." 3 weeks after that day, Isaac and Rebecca were man and wife. Although after that first interview in the cottage parlour, no consideration could induce Mrs. Scatchard to see her son's wife again, or even to talk of her when Isaac tried to plead her cause after their marriage. After some quiet months of married life, Isaac found his wife altering towards him. She grew sullen and contemptuous. She began drinking, and little by little, after the first miserable discovery that his wife was keeping company with drunkards, the shocking certainty forced itself on Isaac that she had grown to be a drunkard herself. He had been in a sadly despondent state for some time before the occurrence of these domestic calamities. His mother's health was failing fast, and he upbraided himself in secret as the cause of the bodily and mental suffering she endured. When to his remorse on his mother's account was added the shame and misery occasioned by the discovery of his wife's degradation, he sank under the double trial. His face began to alter fast, and he looked what he was, a spirit-broken man. His mother, still struggling bravely against the illness that was hurrying her to the grave, was the first to notice the sad alteration in him, and the first to hear of his trouble with his wife. She could only weep bitterly on the day when he made his humiliating confession, but on the next occasion when he went to see her, he found her dressed to go out, and on asking the reason, received this answer. "I am not long for this world, Isaac," she said, "and I shall not feel easy on my deathbed unless I have done my best to the last to make my son happy. I mean to go with you to your wife and try what I can to reclaim her. Give me your arm, Isaac, and let me do the last thing I can in this world to help my son." He could not disobey her, and they walked together slowly towards his miserable home. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when they arrived. It was their dinner hour, and Rebecca was in the kitchen. His wife soon came into the parlour, and the meeting between her and Mrs. Scatchard passed off better than he had ventured to anticipate. He was relieved, however, when the conversation ended, and Rebecca began to lay the cloth for dinner. She brought in the bread tray, cut a slice from the loaf for her husband, then returned to the kitchen. At that moment, Isaac, still anxiously watching his mother, was startled by seeing the same ghastly change pass over her face, which had altered it so awfully on the morning when Rebecca and she first met. Before he could say a word, she whispered with a look of horror, "Take me back. Home again, Isaac. Come with me and never go back again." He was afraid to ask for an explanation. He could only sign her to be silent and help her quickly to the door. As they passed the bread tray on the table, she stopped and pointed to it.
Did you see what your wife cut your bread with?
She asked in a low whisper.
Look.
He did look. A new clasp knife with a buckhorn handle lay with the loaf in the bread tray. His mother caught at his arm.
The knife of your dream, Isaac. Oh, I'm faint with fear. Take me away before she comes back.
He was hardly able to support her. The visible, tangible reality of the knife struck him with a panic. By a desperate effort, he summoned self-possession enough to help his mother out of the house and back to her cottage. Against his mother's most earnest entreaties, Isaac returned home to find that his wife had discovered their secret departure. She had been drinking and was in a fury of passion. The dinner in the kitchen was flung under the grate. The cloth was off the parlour table. Where was the knife? Unwisely, he asked for it. She was only too glad of the opportunity of irritating him. He wanted the knife, did he? Could he give her a reason why? No? Then he should not have it. Not if he went down on his knees to ask for it. Further recriminations elicited the fact that she brought it at a bargain, and that she considered it her own special property. Isaac saw the uselessness of attempting to get the knife by fair means, and determined to search for it later in the day in secret. The search was unsuccessful. Night came on, and he left the house to walk about the streets. He was afraid now to sleep in the same room with her. 3 weeks passed. Still sullenly enraged with him, she would not give up the knife, and still that fear of sleeping in the same room with her possessed him. He walked about at night, or dozed in the parlour, or sat watching by his mother's bedside. Before the expiration of the first week in the new month, his mother died. Isaac was present at her death, and her last words in this world were addressed to him. "Don't go back, my son. Don't go back." He was obliged to go back, if it were only to watch his wife. Exasperated by his distrust of her, she revengefully sought to add a sting to his grief by declaring that she would attend the funeral. In spite of all he could do or say, she held with wicked pertinacity to her words, and on the day appointed for the burial, forced herself, inflamed and shameless with drink, into her husband's presence, and declared that she would walk in the funeral procession to his mother's grave. This last, worst outrage, accompanied by all that was most insulting in word and look, maddened him for the moment. He struck her. The instant the blow was dealt, he repented it. She crouched down, silent, in the corner of the room, and eyed him steadily. It was a look that cooled his hot blood and made him tremble. But there was no time now to think of a means of making atonement. Nothing remained but to risk the worst till the funeral was over. There was but one way of making sure of her. He locked her into her bedroom. When he came back some hours after, he found her sitting very much altered in look and bearing by the bedside, with a bundle on her lap. She rose and faced him with a strange composure. "No man has ever struck me twice," she said, "and my husband shall have no second opportunity. From this day forth, we see each other no more." Before he could answer, she passed him and left the room. He saw her walk away up the street. Would she return? All that night he watched and waited, but no footsteps came near the house. The next night, overcome by fatigue, he lay down in the bed in his clothes, with the door locked, the key on the table, and the candle burning. His slumber was not disturbed. The third night, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth passed, and nothing happened. He lay down on the seventh, still in his clothes, still with the door locked, the key on the table, and the candle burning, but easier in his mind. Easier in his mind and in perfect health of body when he fell off to sleep. But his rest was disturbed. He woke twice without any sensation of uneasiness, but the third time, it was with that never-to-be-forgotten shivering of the night at the lonely inn, that dreadful sinking pain at the heart which once more aroused him in an instant. His eyes opened towards the left-hand side of the bed, and there stood the dream woman again. No, his wife, the living reality, with the dream spectre's face, in the dream spectre's attitude, the fair arm up, the knife clasped in the delicate white hand. He sprang upon her, almost at the instant of seeing her, and yet not quickly enough to prevent her from hiding the knife. Without a word from him, without a cry from her, he pinioned her in the chair. With one hand he felt up her sleeve, and there, where the dream woman had hidden the knife, his wife had hidden it, the knife with the buckhorn handle that looked like new. In the despair of that dreadful moment, his brain was steady, his heart was calm. He looked at her fixedly with the knife in his hand and said these last words: "You told me we should see each other no more, and you have come back. It is my turn now to go, and to go forever. I say that we shall see each other no more, and my word shall not be broken." He left her and set forth into the night. There was a bleak wind abroad, and the smell of recent rain was in the air. The distant church clocks chimed the quarter as he walked rapidly beyond the last houses in the suburb. He asked the first policeman he met what hour that was of which the quarter had just struck. The man referred sleepily to his watch and answered,
2 o'clock.
2 in the morning. What day of the month was this day that had just begun? He reckoned it up from the date of his mother's funeral. The fatal parallel was complete. It was his birthday. Had he escaped the mortal peril which his dream foretold, or had he only received a second warning? As this ominous doubt forced itself on his mind, he stopped, reflected, and turned back again towards the city. He was still resolute to hold his word and never to let her see him more. But there was a thought now in his mind of having her watched and followed. The knife was in his possession, the world was before him, but a new distrust of her, a vague, unspeakable, superstitious dread had overcome him. "I must know where she goes, now she thinks I have left her," he said to himself as he stole back wearily to the precincts of his house. It was still dark. He waited outside, never losing sight of the house till daylight. Then he ventured indoors, listened, and heard nothing. Looked into the kitchen, scullery, parlour, and found nothing. Went up at last into the bedroom. It was empty. Whither had she gone? No mortal tongue could tell him. The darkness had covered her flight, and when the day broke, no man could say where the light found her. Before leaving the house and the town forever, he gave instructions to a friend and neighbor to sell his furniture for anything that it would fetch, and to apply the proceeds towards employing the police to trace her. The directions were honestly followed, and the money was well spent, but the inquiries led to nothing. At this part of the narrative, the landlord paused, and turning towards the window of the room in which we were sitting, looked in the direction of the stable yard. "So far," he said, "I tell you what was told to me. The little that remains to be added lies within my own experience. Between 2 and 3 months after the events I've just been relating, Isaac Scatchard came to me and asked for employment here. He has the perpetual thought that his wife is alive and looking for him. I believe he would not let himself drive off to sleep towards 2 in the morning for a king's ransom. 2 in the morning, he says, is the time she will find him one of these days. 2 in the morning is the time all the year round when he likes to be most certain that he has got the clasp knife safe about him. She's looking for me, is all he says when anybody speaks to him about the one anxiety of his life. She's looking for me. He may be right. She may be looking for him. Who can tell? Who can tell? Said I. She's looking for me.
To be rich is a luxurious sensation. The more so when you have plumbed the depths of hard-upness as a Fleet Street hack, a picker-up of unconsidered pars, a reporter, an unappreciated journalist, all callings utterly inconsistent with one's family feeling and one's direct descent from the Dukes of Picardy. When my Aunt Dorcas died and left me 700 a year and a furnished house in Chelsea, I felt that life had nothing left to offer except immediate possession of the legacy. Even Mildred Mayhew, whom I had hitherto regarded as my life's light, became less luminous. I was not engaged to Mildred, but I lodged with her mother, and I sang duets with Mildred, and gave her gloves when it would run to it, which was seldom. She was a dear, good girl, and I meant to marry her some day. It is very nice to feel that a good little woman is thinking of you. It helps you in your work, and it is pleasant to know she will say yes when you say, will you? But my legacy almost put Mildred out of my head, especially as she was staying with friends in the country. Before the gloss was off my new mourning, I was seated in my aunt's armchair in front of the fire in the drawing room of my own house. My own house. It was grand, but rather lonely. I did think of Mildred just then. The room was comfortably furnished with rosewood and damask. On the walls hung a few fairly good oil paintings, but the space above the mantelpiece was disfigured by an exceedingly bad print, The Trial of Lord William Russell, framed in a dark frame. I got up to look at it. I had visited my aunt with dutiful regularity, but I never remembered seeing this frame before. It was not intended for a print, but for an oil painting. It was of fine ebony, beautifully and curiously carved. I looked at it with growing interest, and when my aunt's housemaid, I had retained her modest staff of servants, came in with the lamp, I asked her how long the print had been there. "Mistress only bought it 2 days before she was took ill," she said. "But the frame, she didn't want to buy a new one, so she got this out of the attic. There's lots of curious old things there, sir." Had my aunt had this frame long? "Oh yes, sir. It must have come long before I did, and I've been here 7 years come Christmas. There was a picture in it. That's upstairs too, but it's that black and ugly it might as well be a chimney back." I felt a desire to see this picture. What if it was some priceless old master, in which my aunt's eyes had only seen rubbish? Directly after breakfast next morning, I paid a visit to the attic. It was crammed with old furniture enough to stock a curiosity shop. All the house was furnished solidly in the mid-Victorian style, and in this room, everything not in keeping with the drawing-room suite ideal was stowed away. Tables of papier-mâché and mother-of-pearl, straight-backed chairs with twisted feet and faded needlework cushions, fire screens of gilded carving and beaded banners, oak bureau with brass handles, a little work table with its faded, moth-eaten silk flutings hanging in disconsolate shreds. On these, and the dust that covered them, blazed the full sunlight as I pulled up the blinds. I promised myself a good time in re-enshrining these household gods in my parlour and promoting the Victorian suite to the attic. But at present my business was to find the picture as black as the chimney back, and presently, behind a heap of fenders and boxes, I found it. Jane, the housemaid, identified it at once. I took it downstairs carefully and examined it. Neither subject nor colour was distinguishable. There was a splodge of a darker tint in the middle, but whether it was figure or tree or house, no man could have told. It seemed to be painted on a very thick panel bound with leather. I decided to send it to one of those persons who pour on rotting family portraits the water of eternal youth. But even as I did so, I thought, why not try my own restorative hand at a corner of it? My bath sponge, soap and nail brush, vigorously applied for a few seconds, showed me that there was no picture to clean. Bare oak presented itself to my persevering brush. I tried the other side, Jane watching me with indulgent interest. The same result. Then the truth dawned on me. Why was the panel so thick? I tore off the leather binding, and the panel divided and fell to the ground in a cloud of dust. There were 2 pictures. They had been nailed face to face. I leaned them against the wall, and the next moment I was leaning against it myself, for one of the pictures was myself, a perfect portrait, no shade of expression or turn of feature wanting. Myself, in the dress men wore when James I was king. When had this been done? And how, without my knowledge? Was this some whim of my aunt's? "Lor, sir!" the shrill surprise of Jane at my elbow. "What a lovely photo it is! Was it fancy ball, sir?" "Yes," I stammered. I don't think I want anything more now. You can go." She went, and I turned, still with my heart beating violently, to the other picture. This was a beautiful woman's picture. Very beautiful she was. I noted all her beauties: straight nose, low brows, full lips, thin hands, large, deep, luminous eyes. She wore a black velvet gown. It was a 3/4 length portrait. Her arms rested on a table beside her, and her head on her hands, but her face was turned full forward, and her eyes met those of the spectator bewilderingly. On the table by her were compasses and shining instruments whose uses I did not know, books, a goblet, and a heap of papers and pens. I saw all this afterwards. I believe it was a quarter of an hour before I could turn my eyes from her. I have never seen any other eyes like hers. They appealed as a child's or a dog's do. They commanded as might those of an empress. "Shall I sweep up the dust, sir?" Curiosity had brought Jane back. I acceded. I turned from her my portrait. I kept between her and the woman in the black velvet. When I was alone again, I tore down The Trial of Lord William Russell, and I put the picture of the woman in its strong ebony frame. Then I wrote to a frame maker for a frame for my portrait. It had so long lived face to face with this beautiful witch that I had not the heart to banish it from her presence. I suppose I'm sentimental, if it be sentimental to think such things as that. The new frame came home, and I hung it opposite the fireplace. An exhaustive search among my aunt's papers showed no explanation of the portrait of myself, no history of the portrait of the woman with the wonderful eyes. I only learned that all the old furniture together had come to my aunt at the death of my great-uncle, the head of the family, and I should have concluded that the resemblance was only a family one, if everyone who came in had not exclaimed at the speaking likeness. I adopted Jane's fancy ball explanation. And there, one might suppose, the matter of the portraits ended. One might suppose it, that is, if there were not evidently a good deal more written here about it. However, to me, then, the matter seemed ended. I went to see Mildred. I invited her and her mother to come and stay with me. I rather avoided glancing at the picture in ebony frame. I could not forget, nor remember without singular emotion, the look in the eyes of that woman when mine first met them. I shrank from meeting that look again. I reorganized the house somewhat, preparing for Mildred's visit. I brought down much of the old-fashioned furniture, and after a long day of arranging and rearranging, I sat down before the fire, and lying back in a pleasant languor, I idly raised my eyes to the picture of the woman. I met her dark, deep, hazel eyes, and once more my gaze was held fixed as by strong magic, the kind of fascination that keeps one sometimes staring for whole minutes into one's own eyes in the glass. I gazed into her eyes and felt my own dilate, pricked with a smart like the smart of tears. "I wish," I said, "oh, how I wish you were a woman and not a picture. Come down, come down." I laughed at myself as I spoke, but even as I laughed I held out my arms. I was not sleepy. I was not drunk. I was as wide awake and as sober as ever was a man in the world. And yet, as I held out my arms, I saw the eyes of the picture dilate, her lips tremble. If I were to be hanged for saying it, it is true. Her hands moved slightly, and a sort of flicker of a smile passed over her face. I sprang to my feet. "This won't do," I said aloud. "Firelight does play strange tricks. I'll have the lamp." I made for the bell. My hand was on it when I heard a sound behind me and turned, the bell still unrung. The fire had burned low, and the corners of the room were deeply shadowed. But surely, there, behind the tall worked chair, was something darker than a shadow. "I must face this out," I said, "or I shall never be able to face myself again." I left the bell, I seized the poker and battered the dull coals to a blaze. Then I stepped back resolutely and looked at the picture. The ebony frame was empty. From the shadow of the worked chair came a soft rustle, and out of the shadow the woman of the picture was coming towards me. I hope I shall never again know a moment of terror as blank and absolute. I could not have moved or spoken to save my life. Either all the known laws of nature were nothing, or I was mad. I stood trembling, but I am thankful to remember I stood still, while a black velvet gown swept across the hearthrug towards me. Next moment a hand touched me. A hand, soft, warm, and human, and a low voice said, "You called me. I am here." At that touch, and that voice, the world seemed to give a sort of bewildering half-turn. I hardly know how to express it, but at once it seemed not awful, not even unusual for portraits to become flesh, only most natural, most right, most unspeakably fortunate. I laid my hand on hers. I looked from her to my portrait. I could not see it in the firelight. "We are not strangers," I said. "Oh no, not strangers." Those luminous eyes were looking up into mine. Those red lips were near me. With a passionate cry, a sense of having recovered life's one great good that had seemed wholly lost, I clasped her in my arms. She was no ghost. She was a woman, the only woman in the world. "How long?" I said. "How long is it since I lost you?" She leaned back, hanging her full weight on the hands that were clasped behind my head. "How can I tell how long? There is no time in hell," she answered. It was not a dream. Ah no, there are no such dreams. I wish to God there could be. When in dreams do I see her eyes, hear her voice, feel her lips against my cheek, hold her hands to my lips as I did that night, the supreme night of my life. At first we hardly spoke. It seemed enough, after long grief and pain, to feel the arms of my true love round me once again. It is very difficult to tell my story. There are no words to express the sense of glad reunion, the complete realization of every hope and dream of a life that came upon me as I sat with my hand in hers and looked into her eyes. How could it have been a dream when I left her sitting in the straight-backed chair and went down to the kitchen to tell the maids I should want nothing more, that I was busy and did not wish to be disturbed, when I fetched wood for the fire with my own hands, and, bringing it in, found her still sitting there, saw the little brown head turn as I entered, saw the love in her dear eyes, when I threw myself at her feet and blessed the day I was born, since life had given me this. Not a thought of Mildred. All other things in my life were a dream. This its one splendid reality. "I'm wondering," she said after a while, when we had made such cheer, each of the other, as true lovers may after long parting. "I'm wondering how much you remember of our past." "I remember nothing but that I love you, that I have loved you all my life," only that I am truly yours, that we have both suffered, that... Tell me, my mistress dear, all that you remember. Explain it all to me. Make me understand. And yet, no, I don't want to understand. It is enough that we are together. If it was a dream, why have I never dreamed it again? She leaned down towards me. Her arm lay on my neck and drew my head till it rested on her shoulder. I am a ghost, I suppose, she said, laughing softly, and her laughter stirred memories which I just grasped at and just missed. But you and I know better, don't we? I will tell you everything you have forgotten. We loved each other. Ah, no, you have not forgotten that. And when you came back from the wars, we were to be married. Our pictures were painted before you went away. You know I was more learned than women of that day. Dear one, when you were gone, they said I was a witch. They tried me. They said I should be burned, just because I had looked at the stars and gained more knowledge than other women. They must needs bind me to a stake and let me be eaten by the fire. And you, far away. Her whole body trembled and shrank. Oh, love, what dream would have told me that my kisses would soothe even that memory? The night before, she went on, the devil did come to me. I was innocent before. You know it, don't you? And even then my sin was for you. For you, because of the exceeding love I bore you. The devil came, and I sold my soul to eternal flame. But I got a good price. I got the right to come back through my picture, if anyone, looking at it, wished for me, as long as my picture stayed in its ebony frame. That frame was not carved by man's hand. I got the right to come back to you, oh, my heart's heart. And another thing I won, which you shall hear anon. They burned me for a witch. They made me suffer hell on earth. Those faces, all crowding round, the crackling wood and the choking smell of the smoke. Oh, love, no more, no more! When my mother sat that night before my picture, she wept and cried, "Come back, my poor lost child." And I went to her with glad leaps of heart. Dear, she shrank from me, she fled, she shrieked and moaned of ghosts. She had our pictures covered from sight and put again in the ebony frame. She had promised me my picture should stay always there. Ah, through all these years, your face was against mine. She paused. But the man you loved? You came home. My picture was gone. They lied to you, and you married another woman. But someday I knew you would walk the world again, and that I should find you. The other gain? I asked. The other gain, she said slowly, I gave my soul for. It is this. If you also will give up your hopes of heaven, I can remain a woman. I can remain in your world. I can be your wife. Oh, my dear, after all these years, at last, at last. If I sacrifice my soul, I said slowly, and the words did not seem an imbecility. If I sacrifice my soul, I win you. Why, love, it's a contradiction in terms. You are my soul. Her eyes looked straight into mine. Whatever might happen, whatever did happen, whatever may happen, our two souls in that moment met and became one. Then you choose. You deliberately choose to give up your hopes of heaven for me, as I gave up mine for you. I will not, I said, give up my hope of heaven on any terms. Tell me what I must do, that you and I may make our heaven here, as now." "I will tell you tomorrow," she said. "Be alone here tomorrow night. 12 is ghosts' time, isn't it? And then I will come out of the picture and never go back to it. I shall live with you and die and be buried, and there will be an end of me. But we shall live first, my heart's heart." I laid my head on her knee. A strange drowsiness overcame me. Holding her hand against my cheek, I lost consciousness. When I awoke, the grey November dawn was glimmering, ghost-like, through the uncurtained window. My head was pillowed on my arm and rested. I raised my head quickly. Not on my lady's knee, but on the needle-worked cushion of the straight-backed chair. I sprang to my feet. I was stiff with cold and dazed with dreams, but I turned my eyes on the picture. There she sat, my lady, my dear love. I held out my arms, but the passionate cry I would have uttered died on my lips. She had said 12 o'clock. Her lightest word was my law. So I only stood in front of the picture and gazed into those grey-green eyes till tears of passionate happiness filled my own. "Oh, my dear, how shall I pass the hours till I hold you again?" No thought, then, of my whole life's completion and consummation being a dream. I staggered up to my room, fell across my bed, and slept heavily and dreamlessly. When I awoke, it was high noon. Mildred and her mother were coming to lunch. I remembered, at 1 o'clock, Mildred coming, and her existence. Now indeed the dream began. With a penetrating sense of the futility of any action apart from her, I gave the necessary orders for the reception of my guests. When Mildred and her mother came, I received them with cordiality, but my genial phrases all seemed to be someone else's. My voice sounded like an echo. My heart was not there. Still, the situation was not intolerable until the hour when afternoon tea was served in the drawing-room. Mildred and mother kept the conversational pot boiling with a profusion of genteel commonplaces, and I bore it, as one in sight of heaven can bear mild purgatory. I looked up at my sweetheart in the ebony frame, and I felt that anything which might happen, any irresponsible imbecility, any bathos of boredom, was nothing, if, after all, she came to me again. And yet, when Mildred too looked at the portrait and said, "Doesn't she think a lot of herself? Theatrical character, I suppose? One of your flames, Mr. Devine?" I had a sickening sense of impotent irritation, which became absolute torture when Mildred— how could I ever have admired that chocolate box barmaid style of prettiness— threw herself into the high-backed chair, covering the needlework with ridiculous flounces, and added, "Silence gives consent. Who is it, Mr. Devine? Tell us all about her. I'm sure she has a story." Poor little Mildred, sitting there smiling, serene in her confidence that her every word charmed me, sitting there with her rather pinched waist, her rather tight boots, her rather vulgar voice, sitting in the chair where my dear lady had sat when she told me her story. I could not bear it. "Don't sit there," I said. "It's not comfortable." But the girl would not be warned. With a laugh that set every nerve in my body vibrating with annoyance, she said, "Oh dear, mustn't I even sit in the same chair as your black velvet woman?" I looked at the chair in the picture. It was the same, and in her chair Mildred was sitting. Then a horrible sense of the reality of Mildred came upon me. Was all this a reality after all? But for fortunate chance, might Mildred have occupied not only her chair, but her place in my life. I rose. "I hope you won't think me very rude," I said, "but I'm obliged to go out." I forget what appointment I alleged. The lie came readily enough. I faced Mildred's pouts with the hope that she and her mother would not wait dinner for me. I fled. In another minute I was safe, alone, under the chill, cloudy autumn sky, free to think of my dear lady. I walked for hours along streets and squares. I lived over and over again every look, word and hand touch, every kiss. I was completely, unspeakably happy. Mildred was utterly forgotten. My lady of the ebony frame filled my heart and soul and spirit. As I heard 11 boom through the fog, I turned and went home. When I got to my street, I found a crowd surging through it, a strong red light filling the air. A house was on fire. Mine! I elbowed my way through the crowd. The picture of my lady, that at least I could save. As I sprang up the steps, I saw, as in a dream, yes, all this was really dreamlike, I saw Mildred leaning out of the first-floor window, wringing her hands. "Come back, sir," cried a fireman. "We'll get the young lady out right enough." But my lady! The stairs were crackling, smoking, and as hot as hell. I went up to the room where her picture was. Strange to say, I only felt that the picture was a thing we should like to look on through the long, glad, wedded life that was to be ours. I never thought of it as being one with her. As I reached the first floor, I felt arms about my neck. The smoke was too thick for me to distinguish features. "Save me," a voice whispered. I clasped a figure in my arms and bore it with strange disease down the shaking stairs and out into safety. It was Mildred. I knew that directly I clasped her. "Stand back!" cried the crowd. "Everyone's safe!" cried a fireman. The flames leaped from every window. The sky grew redder and redder. I sprang from the hands that would have held me. I leaped up the steps. I crawled up the stairs. Suddenly, the whole horror came to me. As long as my picture remains in the ebony frame. What if picture and frame perished together? I fought with the fire, and with my own choking inability to fight with it, I pushed on. I must save my picture. I reached the drawing room. As I sprang in, I saw my lady, I swear it, through the smoke and the flames, hold out her arms to me, who came too late to save her and to save my own life's joy. I never saw her again. Before I could reach her or cry out to her, I felt the floor yield beneath my feet, and I fell into the flames below. How did they save me? What does that matter? They saved me somehow, curse them. Every stick of my aunt's furniture was destroyed. My friends pointed out that, as the furniture was heavily insured, the carelessness of a nightly studious housemaid had done me no harm. No harm. That was how I won and lost my only love. I deny, with all my soul in the denial, that it was a dream. There are no such dreams. Dreams of longing and pain there are in plenty, but dreams of complete, of unspeakable happiness. Ah, no, it is the rest of life that is the dream. But if I think that, why have I married Mildred and grown stout and dull and prosperous? I tell you, it is all this that is the dream, my dear lady only is the reality. And what does it matter what one does in a dream?
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo muttered back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in their step the stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mane of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon my bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock in store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by a seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, whether tempest sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly I implore, is there a balm in Gilead? Tell me I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aiden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend. I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door, take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Ben? The woman stood in the doorway of the ramshackle, tumble-down shanty. Her hands were cupped at her mouth. The wind blew loose, whitish blonde wisps of hair around her face and slashed the faded blue dress into the uncorseted bulk of her body. "Benny? Oh, Benny!" Her call echoed through the still evening. Her eyes, staring straight before her down the slope in front of the house, caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military standing waist-deep and rigid in the cornfield. "That old scarecrow," she muttered to herself. "That there old scarecrow with that there old uniform on to him, too." The sun was going slowly just beyond the farthest hill. The unreal light of the sky's reflected colors held over the yellow, waving tips of the cornfield. "Benny!" she called again. "Oh, Benny!" And then she saw him coming toward her, trudging up the hill. She waited until he stood in front of her. "Supper, Ben," she said. "Was you down in the south meadow where you couldn't hear me call?" No, he was young and slight. He had thick hair and a thin face. His features were small. There was nothing unusual about him. His eyes were deep-set and long, with lids that were heavily fringed. "You heard me calling you?" "Yes, Ma." He stood there straight and still. His eyelids were lowered. "Why didn't you come along, then? What ails you, Benny? Let me shout and shout that way." "Nothing, Ma." "Where was you?" He hesitated a second before answering her. "I was to the bottom of the hill." "And what was you doing down there to the bottom of the hill? What was you doing down there, Benny?" Her voice had a hushed tenseness to it. "I was watching, Ma." "Watching, Benny?" "That's what I was doing." His tone held a guarded sullenness. "'Tain't no such a pretty sunset, Benny." "Wa'n't watching no sunset." "Benny!" "Well?" He spoke quickly. "What do you want me to put it there for? What do you want to do that for in the first place?" "There was birds, Benny. You know there was birds." "That ain't what I mean. What for do you put on that there uniform?" "I ain't had nothing else. There wa'n't nothing but your granddad's old uniform. It's fair in rags, Benny. It's all I had to put on to it." "Well, you done it yourself." "Naw, Benny, naw. 'Tain't nothing but an old uniform with a stick into it, just to frighten off them birds. 'Tain't nothing else. Honest, 'tain't, Benny." He looked up at her out of the corners of his eyes. It was waving its arms. "That's the wind." "Naw, Ma, waving its arms before the wind it come up." "Shush, Benny, 'tain't likely. 'Tain't. I was watching, Ma. I seen it wave and wave. Suppose it should beckon to me. I'd be going then, Ma." "Shush, Benny. I'd fair have to go, Ma." "Leave your mammy?" "No, Ben, no. You couldn't never go off and leave your mammy. Even if you ain't able to bear this here farm, you couldn't go off from your mammy. You couldn't. Not your Ma, Benny." She could see his mouth twitch. She saw him catch his lower lip in under his teeth. "Oh, say you couldn't leave, Benny. Say it." I fair hate this here farm," he mumbled. "Morning and night, and morning and night, nothing but chores and earth, and then some more of them chores. And always that there way. So it is, always, and the stillness, nothing alive, nothing. Sometimes I ain't able to stand it nohow. Sometimes you'll get to like it later, maybe." No, Ma. "You will, Benny, sure you will." "I won't never. I ain't able to help fretting. It's all closed up tight inside of me, eating and eating. It makes me feel sick. She put out a hand and laid it heavily on his shoulder. Likely it's a touch of fever in the blood, Benny. Oh, I ain't got no fever. You'll be feeling better in the morning, Ben. I'll be feeling the same way, Ma. That's just it. Always the same. Nothing but the stillness, nothing alive. And now, there in the cornfield, that ain't alive, Benny. Ain't it, Ma? Don't you say that, Benny, don't. He took her hand off of him. I was watching, he said doggedly. I seen it wave and wave. She turned into the house. That old scarecrow, she muttered to herself. That there old scarecrow. She led the way into the kitchen. The boy followed at her heels. A lamp was lighted on the center table. The one window was uncurtained. With a naked spot of it, the evening glow poured shimmeringly into the room. Inside the doorway, they both paused. You sit down, Benny. He pulled a chair up to the table. She took a steaming pot from the stove and, emptying it into a plate, placed the dish before him. He fell to eating silently. She came and sat opposite him. She watched him cautiously. She did not want him to know that she was watching him. Whenever he glanced up, she hurried her eyes away from his face. In the stillness, the only live things were those two pair of eyes darting away from each other. Benny, she could not stand it any longer. Benny, just you. He gulped down a mouthful of food. Oh, Ma, don't you start nothing. Not no more tonight, Ma. She half rose from her chair. For a second, she leaned stiffly against the table. Then she slipped back into her seat, her whole body limp and relaxed. I ain't going to start nothing, Benny. I ain't even going to talk about this here farm. Honest, I ain't. Oh, this here farm. I gave the best years of my life to it. She spoke the words defiantly. You said that all afore, Ma. It's true, she murmured. Terrible true. And I done it for you, Benny. I wanted to be giving you something. It's all I'd got to give you, Benny. There's many a man, Ben, that's glad of his farm, and grateful, too. There's many that makes it pay. And what'll I do if it does pay, Ma? What'll I do then? I don't know, Benny. It's only just beginning now. But if it does pay, Ma, what'll I do? Go away from here? No, Benny, not away. What'd you go away for, when it pays? After all them years I gave to it? His spoon clattered noisily to his plate. He pushed his chair back from the table. The legs of it rasped loudly along the uncarpeted floor. He got to his feet. Let's go on outside, he said. There ain't no sense to this here talking and talking. She glanced up at him. Her eyes were narrow and hard. All right, Benny. I'll clear up. I'll be along in a moment. All right, Benny. He slouched heavily out of the room. She sat where she was, the set look pressed on her face. Automatically, her hands reached out among the dishes, pulling them toward her. Outside, the boy sank down on the step. It was getting dark. There were shadows along the ground, blue shadows. In the graying skies, one star shone brilliantly. Beyond the mist-slurred summit of a hill, the full moon grew yellow. In front of him was the slope of wind-moved cornfield, and in the center of it the dim military figure standing waist-deep in corn. His eyes fixed themselves to it. Old uniform with a stick into it. He whispered the words very low. Still standing there, still. The same wooden attitude of it, his same cunning watching of it. There was a wind. He knew it was going over his face. He could feel the cool of the wind across his moistened lips. He took a deep breath. Down there in the shivering cornfield, standing in the dark blue shadows, the dim figure had quivered. An arm moved, swaying to and fro. The other arm began swaying. A tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted. The head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell and rose again. The head came up and down and rocked a bit to either side. I'm here, he muttered involuntarily. Here. The arms were tossing and stretching. He thought the head faced in his direction. The wind had died out. The arms went down and came up and reached. Benny, the woman seated herself on the step at his side. Look, he mumbled, look. He pointed his hand at the dim figure shifting restlessly in the quiet, shadow-saturated cornfield. Her eyes followed after his. Oh, Benny. Well, his voice was hoarse. It's moving, ain't it? You can see it moving for yourself, can't you? You ain't able to say you don't see it, are you? The wind, she stammered. Where's the wind? Down there. Do you feel a wind? Say, do you feel a wind? Maybe down there. Ain't no wind. Not now, there ain't. And it's moving, ain't it? Say it's moving, ain't it? It looks like it was dancing, so it does. Like as if it was making itself dance. His eyes were still riveted on those arms that came up and down, and reached. It'll stop soon now. He stuttered it more to himself than to her. Then it'll be alive. I've watched it mighty often. Maybe it knows I watch it. Maybe that's why it moves. Oh, Benny. Well, you see it, don't you? You thought there was something the matter with me when I come and told you how it waves and waves. Now, you seen it waving, ain't you? It's nothing, Ben. Look, Benny. It stopped. The two of them stared down the slope at the dim, military figure standing rigid and waist-deep in the cornfield. The woman gave a quick sigh of relief. For several moments they were silent. From somewhere in the distance came the harsh, discordant sound of bullfrogs croaking. Out in the night, a dog bayed at the golden full moon climbing up over the hills. A bird circled between sky and earth, hovering above the cornfield. They saw its slow descent, and then for a second they caught the startled whir of its wings as it flew blindly into the night. "That old scarecrow," she muttered. "Suppose," he whispered, "suppose when it starts its moving like that, suppose someday it walks out of that there cornfield, just naturally walks out, here to me. What then if it walks out? Benny, that's what I'm thinking of all the time. If it takes it into its head to just naturally walk out here, what's going to stop it if it wants to walk out after me, once it starts moving that way? What? Benny, it couldn't do that, it couldn't. Maybe it won't, maybe it'll just beckon first. Maybe it won't come after me. Not if I go when it beckons. Kind of figure it'll beckon when it wants me. Couldn't stand the other. Couldn't wait for it to come out here after me. Kind of feel like it'll beckon. When it beckons, I'll be going. Benny, there's sickness coming on you. 'Tain't no sickness." The woman's hands were clenched together in her lap. "I wish to God," she said, "I wish I ain't never seen the day when I put that there thing up that there cornfield. But I ain't thought nothing like this could never happen. I wish to God I ain't never seen the day. 'Tain't got nothing to do with you." His voice was very low. "It's got everything to do with me, so it has. You said that afore yourself, and you was right. And I put it up, and I looked high and low the house through. Ain't that old uniform of your granddad's been the only rag I could lay my hands on? Was there anything else I could use? Was there? Oh, Ma, ain't we needed a scarecrow down there, with them birds so awful bad, pecking away at the corn and pecking? 'Tain't your fault, Ma. There wasn't nothing else but that there old uniform. I wouldn't have took it otherwise. Poor old Pa, so desperate proud of it as he was, him fighting for his country in it, always saying that he was. He couldn't be doing enough for his country, and that there old uniform meant so much to him, like a part of him, I used to think it. And you wanting to say something, Ben?" No. He wouldn't even let us be burying him in it. "Put my country's flag next to my skin," he told us. "When I die, keep the old uniform. Just like a part of him," he thought it. "Wouldn't I have kept it, falling to pieces as it is, if there'd have been anything else to put up there in that there cornfield?" She felt the boy stiffen suddenly, and with him a soldier, he broke off abruptly. She sensed what he was about to say. "Oh, Benny, that was different. Honest it was. He wasn't the only one in his family. There was 2 brothers. The boy got to his feet. "Why won't you let me go?" he asked it passionately. "Why do you keep me here? You know I ain't happy. You know all the men have gone from these here parts. You know I ain't happy. Ain't you going to see how much I want to go? Ain't you able to know that I want to fight for my country, the way he did his fighting?" The boy jerked his head in the direction of the figure, standing waist-deep in the cornfield, standing rigidly and faintly outlined beneath the haunting flood of moonlight. "Nah, Benny, you can't go, nah." "Why, Ma? Why do you keep saying that and saying it?" "I'm all alone, Benny. I've gave all my best years to make the farm pay for you. You got to stay, Benny. You got to stay on here with me. You just plain got to. You'll be glad someday, Benny. Later on, you'll be right glad." She saw him thrust his hands hastily into his trouser pockets. "Glad." His voice sounded tired. "I'll be shamed. That's what I'll be. Nothing, do you hear? Nothing but shamed." She started to her feet. "Benny." A note of fear shook through the words. "You wouldn't go?" He waited a moment before he answered. "If you ain't wanting me to go, I'll stay. God, I guess I plain got to Stay. That's a good boy, Benny. You won't never be sorry now how, I promise you. I'll be making that up to you. Honest, I will. There's lots of ways. He interrupted her. Only, Ma, I won't let it come after me. If it beckons, I got to go. She gave a sudden laugh that trailed off uncertainly. Tain't going to beckon, Benny. If it beckons, Ma. Tain't going to, Benny. Tain't nothing but the wind that moves it. It's just the wind, sure. Maybe you got a touch of fever. Maybe you better go on to bed. You'll be all right in the morning. Just you wait and see. You're a good boy, Benny. You'll never go off and leave your ma on the farm. You're a fine lad, Benny. If it beckons, he repeated in weary monotone. Tain't, Benny. I'll be going to bed, he said. That's it, Benny. Good night. Good night, Ma. She stood there listening to his feet thudding up the stairs. She heard him knocking about in the room overhead. The door banged. She stood quite still. There were footsteps moving slowly. A window was thrown open. She looked up to see him leaning far out over the sill. Her eyes went down the slope of the moonlight-bathed cornfield. Her right hand curled itself into a fist. "Oh, Scarecrow," she half laughed. She waited there until she saw the boy draw away from the window. She went into the house and bolted the door behind her. Then she went up the narrow steps. That night she lay awake for a long time. The heat had grown intense. She found herself tossing from side to side of the small bed. The window shade had stuck at the top of the window. The moonlight trickled into the room. She could see the wind-framed, star-specked patches of the skies. When she sat up, she saw the round, reddish-yellow ball of the moon. She must have dozed, because she woke with a start. She felt that she had a fearful, evil dream. The horror of it clung to her. The room was like an oven. She thought the walls were coming together and the ceiling pressing down. Her body was covered with sweat. She forced herself wide awake. She made herself get out of the bed. She stood for a second, uncertain, then she went to the window. Not a breath of air stirring. The moon was high in the sky. She looked out across the hill. Down there to the left, the acres of the potatoes. Potatoes were paying. She counted on a big harvest. To the right, the wheat. Only the second year for those 5 fields. She knew that she had done well with them. She thought with a smile running over her lips back to the time when less than half of the place had been under cultivation. She remembered her dreams of getting the whole of her farm in work. She and the boy had made good. She thought of that with savage complacency. It had been a struggle, a bitter, hard fight from the beginning. She had made good with her farm. And there down the slope just in front of the house, the cornfield, and in the center of it, standing waist deep in the corn, the antiquated military figure. The smile slid from her mouth. The suffocating heat was terrific, not a breath of air. Suddenly she began to shake from head to foot. Her eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on the moonlight-whitened cornfield. Her eyes were held to the moonlight-streaked figure standing in the ghostly corn, moving. An arm swayed to and fro, backwards and forwards, backwards. The other arm swaying, a tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted, the head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell and rose again. The head came up and down and rocked a bit to either side. "Dancing," she whispered stupidly. "Dancing." She thought she could not breathe. She had never felt such oppressive heat. The arms were tossing and stretching. She could not take her eyes from it. And then she saw both arms reach out. And slowly, very slowly, she saw the hands of them, beckoning. In the silence of the room next to her, she thought she heard a crash. She listened intently, her eyes stuck to those reaching arms and the hands of them that beckoned and beckoned. "Benny," she murmured, "Benny." Silence. She could not think. It was his talk that had done this, Benny's talk. He had said something about it. Walking out. If it should come out, moving all over like that, if its feet should start, if they should of a sudden begin to shuffle out of the cornfield. But Benny wasn't awake. He couldn't see it. Thank God. If only something would hold it. If only it would stop. God! Nothing stirred out there in the haunting moonlighted night. Nothing moved, nothing but the figure standing waist deep in the cornfield, and even as she looked, the rigid military figure grew still now, but for those slow, beckoning hands. A tremendous dizziness came over her. She closed her eyes for a second, and then she stumbled back to the bed. She lay there panting. She pulled the sheets up across her face, her shaking fingers working the tops of them into a hard ball. She stuffed it between her chattering teeth. Whatever happened, Benny mustn't hear her. She mustn't waken Benny. Thank heaven Benny was asleep. Benny must never know how, out there in the whitened night, the hands of the figure slowly and unceasingly beckoned and beckoned. The sight of those reaching arms stayed before her. When hours later she fell asleep, she still saw the slow-moving, motionless hands. It was morning when she wakened. The sun streamed into the room. She went to the door and opened it. "Benny?" she called. "Oh, Benny!" There was no answer. "Benny?" she called again. "Get on up. It's late, Benny." The house was quiet. She half-dressed herself and went into his room. The bed had been slept in. She saw that at a glance. His clothes were not there. Down in the field, because she'd forgotten to wake him. In a sudden, stunning flash, she remembered the crash she had heard. It took her a long while to get to the little closet behind the bed. Before she opened it, she knew it would be empty. The door creaked open. His one hat and coat were gone. She had known that. He had seen those two reaching arms. He had seen those two hands that had slowly, very slowly beckoned. She went to the window, her eyes staring straight before her down the slope in front of the house, caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military, standing waist deep and rigid in the cornfield. "You old scarecrow," she whimpered. "Why are you standing there?" She sobbed. "What are you standing still for now?"